They walked into my husband's funeral like they still belonged there. The woman who left him 25 years ago, and the young man she dragged along, claiming to be his son. They stared me down in front of everyone and demanded the ranch and every dollar in the estate. I stood there, holding the urn, feeling like the floor had vanished beneath me. But I did not fall. Not this time. Because what they did not know was that I had been preparing for this for decades, and when the truth came out, it destroyed more than just their lies. They walked into my husband's funeral like they still belonged there. Sylvia had on a long black coat, sunglasses, and that same old smug smile she used to wear when she thought no one noticed. Beside her was a young man I had never seen before, early 30s maybe, tall, polished, not grieving. He adjusted his tie like he was showing up for a board meeting. They didn't sit in the back like decent people. They marched straight up the center aisle, heels clicking, eyes locked on me. And when they reached the front, right as the pastor was about to begin the prayer, Sylvia turned to the room and said, loud and clear, "This is Ethan, my son, David's son, and we're here for what's rightfully ours." I didn't flinch. I tightened my grip on the urn in my lap and stared straight ahead. But I could feel the silence spreading across the church like a cold wind. Old friends whispering, ranch hands glancing at one another. Even the pastor looked unsure whether to continue. I sat there, every nerve in my body screaming but my face still. Because I had expected this. Not the timing, no. That was a new low. But the threat? I had known it was coming. The moment David died, I knew that ghost from the past would crawl her way back, dragging secrets and lies behind her. After the service, people tried to pretend it hadn't happened. Neighbors offered me casseroles and hollow condolences. Sylvia stood near the exit like a politician, shaking hands, introducing Ethan to anyone who'd listen. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. Because what she didn't know was that while she was rehearsing her comeback, I had spent the last 25 years preparing for this day. Back at the ranch, I poured myself a glass of water and walked out to the back porch. The sun was starting to set over the west pasture, casting long shadows across the fence line. The cows were quiet, the wind soft, and I could finally exhale. David had loved this land more than anything, and he had trusted me to protect it, which meant this was not going to be a quiet legal battle behind closed doors. It was going to be a war, and it was going to be public. Later that evening, I found a card tucked into the screen door. No envelope, just a business card. Jacob Lee, attorney at law. I smiled when I saw the name. Jacob had worked for David once, fresh out of law school. Smart, sharp, a little green back then. But he had integrity. The note on the back was short. "Call me, I can help." The next morning, I did. Jacob met me at the kitchen table with a leather briefcase and a calm voice. He had already heard about the funeral stunt. Word travels fast in small towns. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He just opened the file and started reading. David's will, the deed to the ranch, the original divorce agreement with Sylvia. I watched him as he flipped through each page, making notes. Then he looked up and said, "There's no legal claim if what we have here is accurate, but that won't stop them from trying to create one." He was right, because that same afternoon, a manila envelope arrived at my gate. Inside was a copy of a paternity test dated last month. It claimed Ethan was David's biological son. Attached was a formal notice from Sylvia's attorney. They were suing for half the estate. Land, assets, cash, everything. I stood in the kitchen with that paper in my hand and let the silence fill the house. Then I folded it up, placed it neatly on the counter, and made myself a cup of tea. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I had cried enough over Sylvia Morton 25 years ago. I wasn't going to waste another tear now. Instead, I called Jacob and told him we were moving forward. No hesitation, no second thoughts. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, but not the kind they expected. Because I wasn't going to hide behind lawyers or documents. I was going to stand up in court, in public, and make sure the world saw exactly who they were and exactly who I still am. This isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about the lies people tell, the truths they bury, and the fire it takes to burn through it all. And if you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or treated like you didn't matter just because you were quiet, or kind, or chose not to fight back before then maybe, just maybe, this story is for you. The morning after Sylvia's public ambush at the funeral, the ranch felt heavier than usual, not because of the silence, but because of everything that had been left unsaid for decades and suddenly forced into the open like an old wound, split wide in front of strangers. I woke up before sunrise, out of habit more than rest, poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the light creep over the ridgeline as if the land itself was trying to stretch away from what had happened the day before. I had held myself together in that chapel, with her eyes on me and that boy at her side. But now, with no one watching, I let the ache settle in the way old aches do, not loud or dramatic, just persistent, like something you'd lived with so long it became part of you. By mid-morning, Reverend Paul pulled into the driveway in his old Ford, the same one he had been driving since before Sylvia left town. I hadn't expected him, but I wasn't surprised either. He climbed the porch steps without waiting for an invitation, like men of his generation often do when they have something to say they've rehearsed in their heads too many times. He carried a folder under one arm and the kind of look people wear when they're carrying more than papers. He didn't waste time. He told me, plain and clear, that Sylvia had returned to this town once before, years ago, when her face no longer appeared in any of our conversations, and most folks had quietly accepted she was gone for good. She hadn't come to make amends. She hadn't asked about David. According to Paul, she had come with a purpose and a man from out of state, someone with oil money and no morals, the kind who was always sniffing around the edges of ranch land, hoping to turn dirt into dollars. Sylvia, Paul said, had a child with her, a toddler then, and had mentioned casually that the boy's father was someone else, someone who would never be part of his life. She wanted funding, not forgiveness, and she made it known she had taken all she could from her past. Paul had tried to steer her towards some kind of decency, but she smiled like she already knew she wouldn't need it. She had no intention of staying. She just wanted a quick transaction and a quiet exit. That was the Sylvia I remembered. Always angling, always transactional, never still long enough to be held accountable. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, folder in hand, coffee gone cold. The field out front looked the same as it did yesterday, the same as it had for years, but something inside me had shifted. The past wasn't just haunting me, it was circling, and I was done pretending it didn't matter. I called Jacob just after lunch. I told him I needed every document David had locked away, every deed, every trust, every revision to the will. I wanted to hold the bones of this fight in my own hands. I didn't want a filtered version. I didn't want interpretation. I wanted proof. That night, I pulled the gun safe away from the pantry wall and opened the hidden compartment David had built himself, a detail he once said would keep things safe from fire, theft, and family. Inside were two boxes. One was marked legal, the other was unmarked, but I knew it was his personal cash. I opened the legal box first. There it was. A divorce agreement, signed by both David and Sylvia, sealed with the stamp of a notary, and attached to a letter from Sylvia's lawyer. The letter confirmed receipt of a full financial settlement, and in bold type near the bottom, it stated that Sylvia Morton waived all future rights to David Whittaker's estate, present or future. It was the kind of clause lawyers loved and ex-wives underestimated. But David hadn't underestimated anyone. I set the papers aside and opened the second box. It held letters, photographs, and one small cassette tape labeled with nothing more than a year, 1998. I dug out the old player from the attic, dusted it off, and fed the tape in. David's voice crackled to life through the speakers, younger, worn, tired in a way I recognized. He explained that he was recording this in case Sylvia ever tried something. He laid it all out: how she left, how she never looked back, how she took money and swore the child wasn't his. Then he said something that reached across the years and landed straight in my chest. He said, "Lorraine doesn't know I'm recording this, but if she's the one hearing it, then I trust her to handle whatever comes. She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for." I let the tape run to the end before ejecting it. Then I sat at the kitchen table with both boxes and stared at the wood grain until my eyes burned. The fight wasn't theoretical anymore. It was personal, documented, real, and I wasn't going to let them rewrite it. I packed everything neatly, placed the tape on top, and drove to Jacob's house just after midnight. We laid out every paper on his dining room table, side by side, until the wood disappeared under a map of truth and preparation. Jacob read through each one slowly, no longer cautious, no longer skeptical. When he finished, he looked at me with the kind of quiet resolve I had hoped to see. He said we had the advantage, not just legally, morally, visibly, and that if we played this right, it wouldn't just be a win, it would be a message. I nodded. The past had knocked. Now it was my turn to answer. By the time the second sunrise came after the funeral, my world had already shifted more than it had in the last 2 decades. I wasn't mourning in the way people expected. I wasn't wearing all black, clutching tissues, or sitting in silence waiting for casseroles and polite phone calls. I was busy, focused, sharp in a way I hadn't felt since the year we almost lost the ranch to the drought and had to decide whether to sell off the breeding stock or refinance the grain contracts. Back then, David and I stood side by side and held the line together. Now I was standing alone, but the line was still mine to hold. I had just finished reviewing Jacob's draft affidavit when I heard tires on gravel outside. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I wasn't in the mood for neighborly check-ins or social niceties. But when I saw the familiar burgundy truck coming down the drive, I paused. It had been a while since I'd seen that particular hood ornament. Martha Alvarez didn't believe in calling ahead. Never had. She said if you had to ask permission to speak the truth, it wasn't truth worth speaking. She parked, climbed down slow and deliberate, and stepped up onto my porch like it was still hers too. She had been here for every major storm, literal and otherwise, and she always showed up when the sky started to shift. I opened the screen door, and she nodded once, then walked straight into my kitchen like she had every right. She set a grocery bag on the counter. Inside were 2 mason jars of her pickled okra and a loaf of rye bread wrapped in wax paper. She said nothing at first, just took 2 mugs down from my cabinet, filled them with hot water from the kettle already on, and dropped in the peppermint tea bags from her purse. Then she looked me in the eye and asked if the war had officially started yet. Not in question form, just a flat statement waiting for confirmation. I nodded. She sat. We drank in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Then Martha began to speak, not with pity or softness, but with that firm tone she reserved for decisions that couldn't be walked back. She reminded me of the time she had faced her own storm, when her late husband's brother had tried to contest the land deed after her husband passed, claiming that Martha wasn't fit to run their farm alone. That was 15 years ago, and the scars were still visible, not on her face, but in the way she walked with purpose ever since. She said the moment they see you hesitate, they move in faster. The moment you give them even an inch of room to speak over you, they decide they own the whole story. Martha had faced courtrooms, paperwork, threats from men who thought themselves smarter, and a bank manager who once called her emotional in front of the board. She didn't flinch then, and she wasn't flinching now as she reminded me that I had already been through worse. And what stood ahead was just one more test of the spine I'd built over 72 years. I told her about the tape, about David's voice, about the documents in the hidden safe, and how Sylvia had clearly planned this scheme long before David passed. Martha listened without interruption. She didn't gasp. She didn't dramatize. She just absorbed the information and filed it under whatever silent category she kept, for women who had been underestimated too long. Then she said it again, with the calm certainty of someone who had earned her authority. You do not retreat. Not now. Not ever. The thing about Martha was that she didn't give advice. She gave orders, dressed up as observations, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted steel. I wanted someone to look me in the face and tell me I wasn't crazy for feeling like this was not just a personal betrayal, but a calculated campaign against everything I had helped build with my husband. Before she left, Martha walked with me along the north fence line. We hadn't walked that stretch together since before the pandemic, but she remembered where every loose wire had been, every gate that stuck, every post that leaned just slightly from the last windstorm. She told me the fence line was where you saw a ranch's real character, not the front porch, not the dining table. The fence line, because that's where you drew your boundaries and dared the world to cross them. She looked out over the field, the golden sway of prairie grass brushing against her boots, and said that Sylvia would come harder next, that the lawsuit was only her opening shot, that the media coverage and social pressure would follow, and that I had two choices, either fortify now or get washed away later. There was no middle ground left. When Martha left, I stood at that fence line long after her truck had disappeared down the gravel. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who kept quiet at family dinners, the one who let David handle the paperwork, the business meetings, the lawyers, the one who loved the ranch but never put her name on the deeds until he insisted. I wasn't her anymore. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table and rewrote the statement I would give to the court. I removed every soft word, every apology, every phrase that tried to make anyone else comfortable. I rewrote it as a woman who had lived 72 years and had no patience left for performance. I wrote it plainly, strongly in my voice. Then I sent it to Jacob without asking for edits. Later that evening, as I fed the barn cats and checked the porch lights, I noticed the shadows had shifted. The sky had gone pink behind the ridge, and the wind had picked up just enough to rattle the chimes David hung last fall. Something about that sound, faint and metallic, reminded me that a storm was coming. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of the noise. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and laid out my boots for the next morning. Because the truth was, the fight wasn't just coming. I was already in it, and I had no intention of backing down. 2 days after Martha left the ranch, I drove into town just before noon, not to visit anyone or run errands, but to walk through the courthouse doors with my head held high and a thick manila envelope tucked under my arm. The decision had been made. We were not going to play defense anymore. Sylvia had made her move in public. Now it was my turn. The courthouse in our town wasn't large, just 3 floors, a long hallway with creaky floors, and staff who had been there longer than most of the politicians they served. Jacob was already waiting in the lobby, seated on the wooden bench under the dusty oil painting of the original county seal. He stood when he saw me, nodded once, and opened the door to the clerk's office without waiting for pleasantries. We filed the motion to challenge the paternity document submitted by Sylvia's attorney. Along with it, we submitted David's signed divorce settlement, the affidavit I had written myself, and a sworn statement from Reverend Paul, who had agreed to testify under oath about what he remembered from Sylvia's quiet return years ago. Jacob had bundled it all together, page by page, with enough clarity and weight to make it stick. I didn't ask what would happen next. I didn't need to. On the way out, Jacob told me he had spoken to someone in the probate office. Sylvia's attorney had not only filed for Ethan's claim to the estate, but had requested a temporary freeze on David's assets. That meant our ranch bank account, which covered livestock feed, payroll, veterinary care, and property maintenance, was now locked for review. I stopped walking. My boots hit the marble floor and stayed there. For a moment, I felt heat rise in my chest, not from fear, but from something older, something deeper. That ranch had fed people for generations. Locking its accounts was not a technical move. It was a tactic meant to break the bones of the operation, to rattle the employees, to create chaos just long enough for Sylvia to force a settlement. I told Jacob to get it unfrozen. He said he was already working on it. But I could see in his face the pressure of what was coming. This wasn't going to be won in court filings alone. Sylvia wasn't just using law. She was using perception. The town was talking. I could feel it every time I stepped into the feed store or drove past the diner. Eyes lingered a little longer. Some looked away entirely. So that evening, back at the ranch, I sat down at David's old desk in the study and pulled out a yellow legal pad. I wrote for hours. I wrote without filtering or second-guessing. I wrote the truth. Not the court version, not the affidavits. I wrote my version. Who Sylvia had been, what she had done, how she had left, what she had said, the cash settlement she had taken, the letter she wrote David, swearing she would never return. And I ended with what she was doing now, not as a wounded ex-wife, but as a woman who had waited for death to steal a man's defense, and then used lies to claw at the pieces he left behind. Jacob helped me format the letter the next morning. He made a few edits, but mostly he left it untouched. Then he sent it to the local paper, not buried inside, not anonymous. He sent it as an open letter from me, signed and dated, printed on record. 2 days later, it ran on the front page. The title was mine, A Widow's Truth. By noon, I had 3 phone calls, one from the sheriff, asking if I needed security, one from the local radio station requesting an interview, and one from Sylvia's attorney, calling Jacob to accuse us of character assassination. Jacob's reply was short. Truth is not defamation. It was the first time I heard steel in his voice. I was glad for it. The freeze on the ranch account was lifted the next afternoon. No apology from the probate judge. Just a signed order. But it was enough. Feed could be bought. Paychecks could be written. And the men who had worked our land for decades no longer had to guess whether they would be paid by Friday. I knew this wasn't the end of it. It was barely the beginning. But it was our first strike. Public. Precise. Unapologetic. 3 days later, I saw Sylvia for the first time since the funeral. She was leaving the post office as I pulled up. She wore a tailored coat and high boots, as if she was still walking the streets of another city, not the town she once abandoned. Her eyes met mine for only a second before she turned away and stepped into her car. But that second was enough. I saw it. That small flicker of hesitation. She knew we weren't backing down. The next morning, Ethan's name appeared in the newspaper's letters section, a reply to mine. He wrote that he had no intention of causing division, that he believed the law would reveal the truth, and he would abide by it. It sounded rehearsed, polished, a letter written by a lawyer, not a son. Still, it stirred something I wasn't expecting, a kind of hollow sorrow, not for him exactly, but for what he represented. The boy dragged into something older and darker than he understood. He had been raised in the shadow of someone else's bitterness, used as a tool, shaped into a weapon. And now he was standing in a storm he didn't start. But I reminded myself of the tape, of David's voice, of the letter Sylvia wrote, denying David's paternity from the beginning. And I knew Ethan's choice to stand beside her now was just that, a choice. Whatever sympathy I had evaporated the moment he signed his name onto the petition for half the ranch. By the end of the week, Martha returned to the ranch with a box of clippings from her own legal battle years ago. She helped me organize them chronologically, highlighting quotes and outcomes, mapping out strategies on paper like we were planning a campaign, not just a case. She reminded me that family betrayals hit harder than legal ones, and that the only way to reclaim peace was to win completely, not partially. That night, I walked the perimeter of the ranch alone. The stars were clear, the air dry. Every gate was locked, every line of fence was intact. And I told myself, out loud, that this was not just a defense, this was an inheritance worth protecting. I was no longer the woman who avoided confrontation, no longer the wife who let others speak first. I had drawn the line. Now it was up to them whether they dared to cross it. The letter changed the temperature in town. Not overnight, but steadily, like heat rising under the floorboards. For a few days, people were quiet, keeping their opinions tucked behind polite nods and sidelong glances. Then, as expected, the other side answered. It began with an interview. The local news station in the next county over aired a primetime segment titled Legacy in Dispute. Sylvia sat in a high-backed chair at the edge of a tastefully decorated room, her hands folded in her lap, her voice calm, composed, almost soft. She spoke about love, about betrayal, about raising Ethan on her own, about sacrifice. She never named me directly, but she didn't need to. Every word was carefully selected to paint herself as the overlooked first wife, the wronged woman, the mother defending her child's birthright. Ethan made a brief appearance, filmed walking through a field somewhere I didn't recognize, probably rented for the shoot. He said very little, mostly nods, quiet acknowledgements. It was clear he had been instructed to stay neutral in tone but firm in presence. He was the image they wanted. Young, polished, moderate, harmless. Not a man demanding millions, just a son seeking justice. They even interviewed a woman who claimed to have known David during the years after Sylvia left. She alluded to conversations, hinted that David had expressed regrets, said he had always wanted to reconnect with his past. The implication was obvious. The editing sharper than I expected from a local affiliate. By the next morning, the phone at the ranch had rung 17 times. Messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, most of them cautious, some sympathetic, a few outright critical. One asked if I would be giving back any portion of the inheritance to make peace. That was the moment I unplugged the phone. Jacob called before noon. He had seen the segment too. He said he was already drafting a motion to bar any further media influence on the court's proceedings. I told him to go ahead, but I knew it would only slow them down, not stop them. Sylvia wasn't just playing the legal game anymore. She was turning this into a story, and she knew exactly how to sell it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over David's voice in my head, the tape he left behind, his quiet confidence in my strength. Then I remembered something he once said to me after we lost a field to fire. He had stood there, staring at the blackened ground, and said, "Sometimes the wind doesn't change direction until it sees something that won't move." I wasn't going to move. The next morning, a letter arrived from Sylvia's legal team. Official, typed, delivered by courier. It accused me of defamation, demanded a public retraction, threatened a civil suit for damages, claimed the open letter I had published was false, malicious, and intended to sway public opinion unfairly. Jacob read the whole thing aloud at the kitchen table, then folded it and placed it neatly back into the envelope without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The absurdity was obvious. What wasn't absurd was the second letter tucked in the same delivery, a petition to reopen the probate hearing entirely. They wanted a new judge, cited media interference, claimed the current judge had been influenced by public narratives and couldn't remain impartial. This was no longer just a fight over inheritance. This was strategy, delay, disrupt, exhaust. Jacob spent the next 2 days filing responses. We met with the probate clerk, provided our own documentation proving the facts in the open letter. We requested the inclusion of David's taped statement in the case file, supported by a notarized transcript. Every move they made, we answered with 2 of our own. But I could feel it, the emotional toll setting in. Not fear, not regret. Something colder, fatigue. The kind that doesn't come from weakness, but from carrying weight for too long with no one to share it. That Friday, while walking the fence line behind the north barn, I found something strange. A drone. It was small, wedged between the base of 2 posts, its blade cracked. At first I thought it was a toy, maybe flown from one of the neighboring properties, but when I brought it inside, Jacob had someone check it. The drone had a camera. The footage, once recovered, showed multiple passes over the ranch. The gates, the paddocks, the main house. Someone had been watching. Jacob filed an injunction the next morning. He also contacted local law enforcement, not just for the drone, but for ongoing harassment. Unmarked cars had started passing by the ranch more frequently. A neighbor had seen someone photographing the mailbox from across the road. Sylvia's campaign wasn't just legal and media-based anymore. It had become invasive. I tightened the locks on the barn doors, installed motion lights on the back porch. I refused to be intimidated, but I wasn't foolish either. You don't raise cattle for 4 decades without learning the difference between barking and a real bite. This wasn't just noise. This was escalation. Still, in the midst of it all, the ranch kept running. Hay was cut, fences repaired, animals fed and watered. Payroll went out. No one missed a beat. If Sylvia's goal had been to destabilize me, she had failed. If it had been to shake my confidence, she had misjudged the foundation it rested on. And then came the second television segment. This time, the anchor referenced our financial records. Not the ones we had released, the ones Sylvia's team had submitted as part of their petition. Somehow, details about our mortgage history, our ranch profits, and even charitable contributions had made it into a public file, and from there into broadcast. It was legal, barely, but unethical by every standard Jacob had ever known. And it worked. Because now, the conversation had changed. No longer just a widow versus a first wife. Now it was about money, power, image. Martha returned that night, said nothing as I handed her the transcript of the broadcast. She read it once, then tore it in half and dropped the pieces in my fireplace. That was her answer. Then she looked me in the eye and said I had one job now: outlast. Not just survive, outlast. The next morning I put on my boots, saddled my horse, and rode the perimeter of the property before the sun came up. I needed to feel the land beneath me, hear the wind move through the cottonwoods, let the silence speak louder than any letter ever could. I was still here. I wasn't leaving. And no matter what story they tried to spin, the truth didn't need a spotlight. It just needed time to stand its ground. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse parking lot was half full before the sun had even touched the east side of the building. Not with crowds, but with cameras, satellite vans, a handful of reporters scribbling notes, looking for someone to speak. I kept my head low as Jacob opened the car door for me, and Martha walked beside me in silence, her hand lightly touching my arm, not guiding, just present. I didn't need help walking. I needed help staying calm. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Fluorescent lighting hummed above us as we moved down the hallway. We passed a man mopping the floor near the elevators. He paused, nodded once at me, then returned to his work. That single nod did more for my nerves than 100 words could have. A quiet acknowledgement that not everyone was buying into Sylvia's theatre. Courtroom 2B wasn't big. No marble, no grandeur, just long wooden benches and a modest bench up front where the judge would sit. I took my seat behind Jacob, next to Martha, her coat folded neatly over her lap. Across from us, Sylvia sat flanked by her lawyers, Ethan beside her, freshly pressed shirt, hair parted with precision, no emotion in his face. Just readiness. The judge entered promptly at 9. No theatrics, no robe flourishes. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the file in front of him, and spoke without raising his voice. This wasn't television. This was real. Jacob opened with facts, calm, measured. He laid out the probate timeline, the details of David's will, the distribution of assets, and the notarized video statement David had recorded. He didn't appeal to emotion, he didn't speculate. He presented signatures, dates, bank transfers, letters from David's accountant. Then he submitted 2 sealed envelopes. The judge nodded, motioned for them to be logged as evidence. Sylvia's lawyer objected immediately, claimed the video should be inadmissible, citing potential coercion and mental incapacity. Claimed the sealed documents were an attempt to manipulate the court. The judge allowed the objection to be noted, but not sustained. He said he would review everything personally before issuing any ruling. Then came Sylvia's turn. Her lawyer stood and addressed the court with theatrical pacing. He framed Sylvia's absence from David's life as circumstantial, claimed her departure years ago had been misunderstood, spoke about struggle, about redemption, about a woman who had suffered in silence and now only sought fairness. He painted me as a gatekeeper of fortune, clinging to power that rightfully belonged to others. Ethan remained seated throughout. His expression never shifted. His hands never moved. But his eyes flicked toward mine once. Brief, almost unsure. Then back to the table. Their teams submitted affidavits from people who allegedly knew David in the early years. None of them present in court. None of them cross-examined. Just paper. Typed words. Stories. No hard proof. But the presentation was slick. The strategy clear. Flood the room with suggestion. Make it feel like truth through repetition. Then the twist came. Sylvia's lawyer produced a recent DNA test, allegedly proving Ethan's paternity beyond dispute. It had been rushed through a private lab. The results printed and highlighted in yellow. Jacob stood instantly. Objected on the grounds of chain of custody and lab credibility. He requested a forensic review. The judge paused, looked between both lawyers, then allowed the test to be entered conditionally, pending further validation. It was a blow, but not fatal. Jacob leaned over to me and whispered, "Let them play every card now. We hold the last one." When court recessed for lunch, I stayed in the hallway, didn't eat, just sat on a bench and listened to the muffled footsteps of passers-by. Sylvia walked past once, slow, her eyes fixed ahead. Ethan trailed a few steps behind her. Neither acknowledged me. After lunch, the judge reconvened and addressed the media presence directly. Cameras were barred, reporters instructed to remain outside the chamber. Then he turned his attention to the sealed envelopes Jacob had submitted earlier. Jacob rose and asked permission to read from the enclosed documents. The judge approved. He read aloud a letter from David, dated 8 months before his death. In it, David explicitly stated his awareness of Sylvia's attempt to re-enter his life. He referenced a phone call she made, asking for reconciliation, citing her changed circumstances. He noted that she had inquired about his finances, asked about his health, and made statements that left him uneasy. He ended the letter with a clear declaration that no part of his estate was to be considered accessible to Sylvia or any child not legally acknowledged before the date of the letter. Then came the second document, a sworn affidavit from David's longtime physician. It stated that David was of sound mind during the period in question. It also included notes from a routine checkup just 2 weeks before he recorded the video statement. No cognitive issues, no signs of coercion, stable blood pressure, clear comprehension. The statement closed with a line that struck like thunder in that quiet room. In my professional opinion, David Templeton was fully capable of understanding the legal and emotional weight of every document he signed. The courtroom fell still. Sylvia's team requested a delay, citing the need to review the documents. The judge refused. He stated that both sides had been given ample time. He scheduled a ruling for the following week. Court adjourned. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not victorious, just clearer. The fog of uncertainty had thinned. We hadn't won yet, but the ground had shifted. On the ride home, Martha remained silent, her hands clasped in her lap. I looked out the window, past the passing trees and fences, and thought about David, about how he must have known this day would come, about how he'd tried to protect me, not with drama, but with documentation, with foresight, with trust. Back at the ranch, I changed into work clothes and walked the field alone. The wind moved slow, steady. I let it pass through me without resistance. Not because I was tired, but because I was ready. Let them come again. Let them scream louder. My answers wouldn't come in interviews or on stages. They would come, like David's did, in writing, in truth. And in the silence that followed once the storm ran out of thunder. The next morning, the ranch was quieter than usual. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I woke before the sun, sat with a cup of black coffee, and stared out across the frost-tipped fields. The hearing had cracked something open, not just in the courtroom, but in me. I could feel it in the stillness of the house, in the way Jacob had stood a little straighter when we left the courthouse, and in the way Martha had looked at me across the dinner table without saying a word. We all knew we were past the point of retreat. At 9 sharp, Jacob arrived with a thick leather binder under his arm. He wasn't in a suit this time, just jeans and a wool coat. Still, the weight of the day was with him. We met in the study, where David used to read the paper by the fire. Martha brought tea, then left the room without a word. She knew this wasn't a conversation for too many ears. Jacob opened the binder and began sorting documents across the coffee table, each page neatly tabbed, each section labeled in bold. There was a clarity in his movements, like someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. I sat across from him and waited. No rush, no pleasantries. He looked up, nodded once, and began. He started with what he called the firewall, a breakdown of the estate assets that had been transferred legally and irrevocably into trusts before David passed. The ranch, the machinery, the investments, all protected by clauses David had insisted on during his final months. Jacob had worked with a specialist to ensure that even a skilled legal team like Sylvia's would struggle to touch those without creating a very public scandal. Next came the trap. Jacob opened a new folder and handed me a copy of an email. It was between Sylvia and a man named Franklin Bauer. At first glance, it looked benign, a discussion about a potential estate claim. But Jacob had traced the man's address. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't even based in the country. He was a fixer, a man tied to offshore accounts and under-the-table arrangements. According to Jacob, Sylvia had contacted him 2 months before David died, asking about ways to freeze assets and stall probate using anonymous filings. The digital trail was incomplete, but it was enough. Enough for what? I asked. Jacob leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told me the plan. We weren't going to fight this in the courtroom anymore. We were going to fight it in public, quietly, deliberately, legally, but publicly. We would leak just enough of the truth to make Sylvia's story fall apart under its own weight. Jacob had lined up an investigative reporter with a small but credible local paper, not a tabloid, a community journal with a reputation for integrity. They would receive redacted documents, email records, a timeline of Sylvia's contact with David, the video testimony. Nothing sensationalized, just facts. Facts with teeth. And then came the final piece. Jacob pulled out a yellow envelope with my name written on it in David's handwriting. I hadn't seen that script since the last birthday card he'd left on the nightstand for me. My hands trembled a little as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated 3 weeks before his heart attack. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding. It was just him, speaking to me, explaining the fear he had carried about Sylvia's reappearance, his regret for ever trusting her once, his anger at the thought of her dragging a child into it, real or not, and then a final paragraph that stopped my breath. He had made a video, not the one the court had already seen, a second one, private, recorded 2 days after the first, left with a notary friend in town. A message just for Ethan. Jacob had already retrieved it. And in that message, David told Ethan he had once believed Sylvia's story, that he had been open to the possibility of reconciliation, but that after seeing the way she operated and the people she surrounded herself with, he no longer had any doubt that Ethan was part of a larger plan. David didn't say whether Ethan was truly his son. He said it didn't matter. He said trust was earned, not inherited. That family was more than a claim on a deed or a bank account. It was time, loyalty, truth. Jacob planned to release that video only if the final hearing went sideways. It was our insurance policy, one that would end Ethan's credibility without ever needing to take a test again. Not through scandal, through clarity. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. The silence settled again. It wasn't vengeance I felt. It was precision. We didn't need to scream. We just needed to stay steady. By afternoon, the plan was in motion. Jacob returned to town to coordinate with the reporter. Martha went to the post office with a sealed envelope for the notary, and I walked the perimeter of the ranch, just like David used to. I touched the gate where he'd once carved our initials. I ran my fingers along the barn door, and when I reached the edge of the fence, I looked out toward the road where Sylvia's car had once parked on a rainy morning 3 months ago. The first day of all this. They thought they could break me. That time and grief would make me careless. But grief had sharpened me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was leading. and by the time the court reconvened, it wouldn't be my name on trial. It would be theirs. The article came out on a Thursday morning, not with fanfare, not with headlines in bold caps, just a clean title across the top of a trusted local paper. Inheritance Dispute Clouds Longtime Ranch Legacy. Jacob had chosen the journalist carefully, and it showed. The writing was sharp, but careful. It told the story of a family torn apart by an unexpected inheritance, a mysterious claimant, and documents that seemed to contradict public statements. No accusations, just evidence. By noon, I had 5 voicemails from neighbors, 2 casseroles dropped off on the front porch, and a call from the sheriff's wife asking if I was all right. I told her I was just fine. Sylvia, on the other hand, was not. By evening, word had spread beyond the valley. A regional news site picked up the story. Then a small network affiliate called Jacob's office asking for comment. He declined, but it didn't matter. The information was out there. The timeline of Sylvia's sudden reappearance, the offshore fixer, the inconsistencies in Ethan's documents, the redacted emails, and the fact that David had submitted 2 conflicting testimonies before his death. The public might not have known every detail, but they knew enough to doubt her. The next morning in court, the mood had shifted. Judge Wexler entered with less patience than before. Her eyes skimmed the room like a hawk looking for its prey. I sat with Jacob on one side. Sylvia and Ethan sat across the aisle. Sylvia looked paler than I remembered, her lips tight and her eyes flicking back and forth between the reporters seated behind us. She knew. Ethan sat still, jaw clenched, fingers tapping rhythmically on his knee. The judge cleared her throat and spoke firmly. The public spectacle had not gone unnoticed. She addressed the court with a warning. The case would continue based on law, not media pressure. But her tone had changed. More clipped, less lenient. Jacob stood and made his final submissions. He laid out the trust structure, the clear legal transfers, the forensic analysis of the supposed signature from David on Ethan's acknowledgement papers. And then, with careful precision, he played the second video. The courtroom went still as David's face flickered onto the screen. The lighting was dimmer than the first, his voice softer, but his words were deliberate. He looked straight into the camera and spoke directly to Ethan. He said he wanted to believe, that he had opened his heart at first. But over time, too many pieces hadn't added up. He spoke of Sylvia's patterns, her manipulations, the way she used legal grey areas and emotional leverage. He didn't say Ethan was a liar. He simply said Ethan had allowed himself to be used. He ended with a line I'll never forget. "You may carry my blood, but you do not carry my name." The room sat in stunned silence. When the video ended, Judge Wexler asked if there was anything further. Sylvia's attorney stood, but she waved him down. Her mouth twitched, and for the first time, I saw the performance falter. Her voice shook when she spoke. She claimed David had been under duress, that he had been manipulated by those around him, that his mental state had deteriorated. She painted me as the one who had isolated him, who had poisoned his final days. But it was too late. The documents didn't lie. The emails didn't lie. And David's own voice rang louder than any rebuttal she could conjure. The judge called a brief recess. Jacob and I stepped outside. He didn't say much, just handed me a bottle of water and told me to breathe. We stood under the shadow of the courthouse steps. The late autumn wind carried a bite. Reporters lingered by the curb, unsure whether to approach. I met their eyes, then looked away. Back inside, the judge returned with her ruling. She began by acknowledging the complexity of the case, the emotional weight, the competing narratives. But ultimately, she said, The court was bound by law and truth, not speculation or sentiment. She ruled the original will to be valid, the trusts legally binding. The secondary filings from Sylvia and Ethan were deemed insufficient, and in several cases, intentionally misleading. She dismissed their claims in full. Then she paused. Her eyes moved from Jacob to me, then finally landed on Sylvia. She stated for the record that the court had serious concerns about potential fraud and misrepresentation in the materials submitted by the petitioners. She would be referring aspects of the case to the county prosecutor for review. The words hung in the air like cold steel. Sylvia's mouth opened slightly. Ethan turned to her, his expression stunned. This was not a mere loss. This was exposure. Consequences. Legal consequences. The judge banged her gavel. It was over, or so I thought. As people filed out of the courtroom, I remained seated. My legs were steady, but my chest felt tight. Not with fear, with release. For the first time since David died, I felt the tension lift from my bones. I had not only defended what was ours, I had defended him, his name, his memory. Outside, reporters swarmed Jacob, but he held up a hand and said no comment. Martha was waiting at the truck. She didn't speak, just nodded and opened the door for me. When we got home, the sky had started to darken. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl David had given me one Christmas long ago. The dogs rested at my feet. Jacob came by later to deliver copies of the ruling. He said the media would calm down soon, that the prosecutors might or might not pursue charges. It was out of our hands now. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Sylvia and Ethan had tried to rewrite my story, tried to steal more than money. They wanted my silence, my defeat. But instead, I had spoken. I had fought. And the world had listened. That night, as I climbed into bed, I placed David's letter back in its envelope and slipped it into the drawer. Not to hide it, just to keep it close. It had done its job. So had I. And the next chapter of my life, for the first time in a long while, would not begin in court. It would begin here, on the land we built, and it would be mine. 3 days after the court ruling, I received a letter, not a formal one. No envelope with a return address, just a folded piece of paper, slipped under the wooden gate sometime before dawn. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, and impatient. Sylvia. She wanted to talk. For a moment, I considered tearing it up and throwing it in the fireplace. But something in me knew this moment had been coming. It wasn't finished. Not until I looked her in the eyes and saw if there was anything left behind those lashes but calculation. I didn't call Jacob. I didn't tell Martha. I simply walked down to the old greenhouse at the back of the property, where the wind didn't cut so sharply. I unlocked the door and waited. She arrived right before sunset. No makeup. A tan trench coat, wrinkled and too thin for the weather. Her steps were hesitant, but not fragile. She pushed the door open like she still owned space. Like time hadn't carved the distance between us. We stood facing each other, the cold air heavy around us. The silence was brittle. She was the first to speak. "You always did like drama," she said. "A whole courtroom performance just to prove you won." I didn't respond. I waited. She scoffed, eyes scanning the cracked concrete floor and dusty glass panes overhead. "I came back because I thought we could make peace," she said. "You think I wanted any of this? The money? The land? I only wanted to be seen?" I took a step closer, steady. "You forged a signature. You submitted false documents. You sent your son to lie under oath. Her mouth tightened. You made yourself invisible. Not me. She looked up at me then, really looked. And there it was, not remorse, not shame, but rage cloaked in injury. Like the villain in her story was always someone else, never her. You think I had it easy, she said. You married him. You got the house, the respect, the name. I was pushed out from the moment I was born. He never let me in. He gave you everything he could, I said. But you never came back without a price tag. She took a shaky breath. Her voice lowered. I was drowning, and no one threw a rope. Not him, not you. So yes, I reached for what I could. That ranch should have been mine. You think raising Ethan alone was easy while you played wife of the year? I kept my eyes on her. You abandoned that boy, and then you came back only to use him. She flinched, just slightly. Then her voice sharpened. You think you're clean in all this, but you were always waiting, watching, keeping score. I don't keep score, I said. I bury the dead and protect the living. That's what David taught me. She looked away. I never got to say goodbye to him, she whispered. You shut me out. You did that yourself, I replied. Years ago. With every lie, every deal behind his back, every time you called only when you needed something. Silence again. She looked smaller now, not in stature but in presence, like the structure that had held her upright all this time had quietly collapsed. Her shoulders dropped, her breath uneven. So, what happens now? She said, her voice low. I paused. Then I spoke slowly. You leave this land. You leave my name. You leave this story behind. She blinked, lips parting slightly. And if I don't, she said. I stepped forward, gaze steady. Then I'll finish what I started. And this time, it won't end in court. It will end in silence. You will simply disappear, Sylvia. From this town, from this family, from history. Her expression faltered. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not of me, but of the emptiness that came with irrelevance, of being forgotten. I turned and walked to the greenhouse door. Before I opened it, I said one last thing. He never stopped loving you, you know, but he stopped trusting you, and you gave him no reason to change his mind. Then I stepped out into the wind and left her standing alone. That night, I didn't sleep, not because of fear, not even adrenaline, but something else. A strange calm mixed with a hollow ache, the kind that comes when the storm has passed, but the debris still litters the ground. Martha brewed tea at dawn. She didn't ask anything, just handed me the mug and sat beside me on the porch. We watched the sun creep up behind the pine ridge, light spilling slow and soft. Later that day, Jacob called. The county prosecutor had opened an investigation into fraud and attempted extortion. Sylvia and Ethan would be summoned for questioning. There would be no need for me to appear again unless it went to trial. I told him thank you. Then I hung up and sat still. I knew I should feel triumphant, and part of me did. But there was also a quiet sorrow curled up in the corners of my chest, the kind that didn't ask to be healed, just witnessed. It was the cost of truth, of choosing to speak when silence would have been easier. Sylvia had been a part of my life for so long, even as a threat, even as a shadow. And now she would be gone. And in that absence, I would have to relearn peace. I stood and walked to the barn, ran my fingers across David's old workbench. The wood was worn smooth with time. In one of the drawers, I found a photo. Him and I, years ago, at the county fair. He was holding a ribbon. I was holding his arm. I smiled. Then I folded the picture, placed it in my coat pocket, and walked out into the light. A week after Sylvia's visit to the greenhouse, everything began to unravel. It started with a quiet call from Jacob. The prosecutor's office had moved forward. Official charges were filed. Fraud, forgery, attempted extortion, all tied to Sylvia. And Ethan, too, for his role in falsifying documents and participating in the staged inheritance claim. I listened carefully, my breath steady. There was no glee in my chest, no sense of triumph, only the weight of what I already knew. The wheel had turned, the reckoning had arrived. Sylvia was arrested that evening, not with drama, but with the kind of silence that screams. She was taken from a rental apartment on the edge of town. No one had seen her much since the court loss. Ethan was already gone. Rumor said he'd left for Arizona, trying to stay ahead of whatever storm was coming. But storms follow their architects. By morning, the local paper ran the story, not on the front page, but in the legal section. The name Whitaker still carried weight, even after all these years. My name, and David's. I sat with the article in my lap, eyes tracing each printed line. No photos, just words, charges, consequences, statements. Martha read over my shoulder. She didn't say anything, just placed her hand gently on mine and let it rest there. The days that followed were a blur of movement. Reporters called. Old acquaintances from church whispered in parking lots. Some looked at me with pity, others with admiration, most with confusion, unsure how to reconcile the calm widow on a farm with a family headline like that. But I didn't hide. I kept my routine, fed the animals, walked the trails behind the barn, baked sourdough for the local co-op. Life moved forward, one task at a time, and in that rhythm, I found my breath again. Then came the letters. The first was from Sylvia's attorney, a last attempt at negotiation. She wanted to drop the charges if I would agree to silence. No further lawsuits, no further statements. As if all of this could be folded neatly into some legal napkin and tucked away. I declined. The second letter came from Ethan, handwritten, short, apologetic in a way that felt borrowed, not earned. He said he hadn't known the full extent of what his mother planned, that he thought it would just be a family inheritance dispute, not a felony. He ended the letter with a sentence that stayed with me. I didn't know how much she hated you until it was too late. I folded the paper and placed it in the kitchen drawer. I neither forgave nor pursued him. Some sins don't need revenge, only distance. A few days later, Martha brought news from town. Sylvia had been released on bond. Her arraignment was scheduled for the following month. But she wasn't back in town. She'd vanished again, likely hoping public memory would fade faster than the court calendar. I felt no urgency. Let her run. Let her disappear into silence. But justice, like truth, has its own sense of time. I focused instead on what came next. With Jacob's help, I finalized the trust David and I had started years ago. I added new provisions, not for our children, but for women in this county who'd lost everything, through divorce, betrayal, or silence. A foundation that would bear my name and his, but serve women like the one I had been. I also made a decision about the ranch. It would not be sold, not parceled out. It would remain whole, functional, and alive. A place for healing and growth. I invited 3 local nonprofits to operate programs on the land: job training, trauma recovery, sustainable farming. I wanted this soil to serve life again, not greed. On the final night of the week, I sat alone in David's study. The fire crackled low. The wind outside tapped gently at the windows. I held a photograph in my hands, one of him, smiling in that way he always did when I surprised him with peach cobbler. His eyes twinkled, the lines around them deep and honest. I whispered softly, "It's done now." And I felt it. The final strand break, the last grip of pain loosen. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had chosen not to carry what wasn't mine anymore. The betrayal, the loss, the years of feeling like a placeholder in someone else's narrative. It was over. Sylvia had built a world on resentment and lies. I had built one on silence and endurance. And now I was building something new, something rooted in dignity. The following morning, I walked the eastern ridge at sunrise. The frost crunched under my boots. The sky bloomed soft pink and gold. I breathed deep. Down the hill, Martha waved from the porch. Jacob's car pulled up moments later. Life, full and persistent, kept arriving. I waved back. Then I turned toward the path and kept walking, each step lighter than the last. The days moved with a different weight now. Not lighter, not heavier, but clearer. As if a fog had finally lifted and I could see the outlines of what had always been there. My strength, my home, my right to peace. Jacob called to confirm the foundation paperwork was filed. The trust was active. Grants would begin rolling out in the spring. I thanked him, then sat on the porch for a long time, letting that reality sink into my bones. For years, I had been written out of my own life, first by grief, then by the quiet cruelty of those closest to me. Now, everything had changed, not because I had shouted, but because I had stood still until they exposed themselves. Martha stopped by that afternoon with 2 loaves of banana bread and a basket of herbs from her garden. She didn't stay long. We didn't need to say much. She saw the steadiness in my face. I saw the pride in hers. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed, I returned to the greenhouse. The rows of green were fuller than ever. I had added new trays, new soil, and a second light fixture. It no longer looked like a side hobby. It looked like a choice, a declaration, something living I had made with my own hands. Each plant had its rhythm, its stubbornness, its fragility. In a way, they reminded me of women like me, those who endured and broke through. News from town drifted in over the days. Sylvia had skipped her second court date. A bench warrant was issued. No one had seen her since. Ethan's name came up in connection with another investigation in a nearby state. Identity fraud. Tax evasion. I didn't read every detail. Some things I didn't need to know anymore. I was no longer tethered to their choices. Instead, I spent time finishing a letter I had been working on. It was to David. Not because I believed he could read it, but because I needed to say things out loud. Or maybe, on paper. I told him everything that had happened. I told him I wished he had warned me more clearly, but I also told him I understood now. The silence had been his shield, and mine. But silence had limits. I had found my voice. That same week, I was invited to speak at a small gathering hosted by one of the non-profits the Trust now supported. Women of all ages, sitting in a circle in the back room of the community center. They didn't know my story in full. They didn't need to. I spoke simply. About loss. About inheritance. Not of money, but of wounds. Of resilience. Of the quiet strength it takes to keep living when people try to erase you. When I finished, a woman in the back, grey-haired, soft-spoken, stood and said she hadn't told her own daughter she'd survived cancer, that she hadn't wanted to burden her. And now her daughter barely called, and she wondered if her silence had been a mistake. I walked over and took her hand. We don't always choose our battles. but we can choose when we stop hiding." She nodded. Then she cried. I returned home that evening with the hum of the highway behind me and the hush of the fields ahead. I parked the truck by the barn and sat in the cab for a moment, eyes on the house. This house. My house. Not because of the deed or the money or even the memory of David, but because I had stayed. I had rebuilt. I had not let them push me out of my own life. Inside, I lit a fire and poured tea. I sat in the living room with the lights low, the windows open to the night air. I thought of Sylvia's last words to me in the greenhouse. "You always thought you were better than me." Maybe I had. Or maybe I had just survived better. Not by climbing over people, but by planting roots deeper than theirs could ever reach. That night, I dreamed of a house filled with light and music. Women in the kitchen, laughter in the hallway. No tension, no suspicion, just warmth. When I woke, the sun was breaking through the clouds. I pulled the curtains open wide and let it in. The first snow of winter came quietly. I woke early, before the sky shifted from slate to blue, and saw the fine layer of white across the fields. No wind, no tracks, no noise. Just stillness. I made a pot of coffee and stood at the window, watching the light unfold over the land I had almost lost. But not anymore. The greenhouse was still lit from the night lamp. The last batch of lettuce had come in strong, and the herbs were holding up better than expected. It had become more than a hobby, more than a sanctuary. It had become the heart of my new life. And that morning, I was not alone. Martina arrived a few minutes after sunrise, bringing fresh bread, 2 jars of soup, and a folded letter from the legal clinic. She handed it to me without saying much. I opened it at the kitchen table and read it slowly. The court had finalized the forfeiture on Sylvia's seized assets. All accounts frozen. Her attempt to move funds through shell LLCs had failed. Ethan, too, had been denied bail in another state. The judge's notes were clipped to the back. Words like intentional misrepresentation and abuse of fiduciary duty. A part of me had expected this outcome. Another part of me still marveled that it had happened so cleanly. Martina poured coffee. She sat down across from me and said the words I had waited nearly a year to hear. "It's done now." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed a little deeper, as if my ribs had finally unlocked after months of pressure. Later that day, I walked to the north edge of the property where the woods met the fence line. That used to be David's favorite spot. He would sit there with a thermos, watching the deer in the distance and the sun pour through the trees. I sat where he used to sit and pulled the final piece of my plan from my coat pocket. It was a copy of the land trust certification, signed, notarized, filed. The foundation had acquired an adjoining parcel, 30 acres of wetlands that would now be preserved, used for educational programs, and named in memory of my mother, who had taught me how to prune, how to trim, how to heal things with my hands. I felt a shift in the air then, not a gust of wind, but something inside me settling. The fight had been long, but I had not just survived it. I had outlasted it, and I had done so without turning into the thing I fought. In the weeks that followed, I began to open the house again, quietly, carefully, not to family, not to those who had harmed me, but to those who needed it. A single mother from town came to learn how to grow herbs. An older widow from the next county dropped by to volunteer. A teenager helped me build new frames for seed trays. I never announced it. I never made a sign. But somehow, word traveled, and what had been mine alone began to breathe with new life. One afternoon, as I wiped soil from my palms and locked the greenhouse door, I looked out across the yard and saw a boy throwing sticks for a dog. He laughed. the kind of laugh that breaks through everything. His grandmother stood nearby, wrapped in a thick coat, watching him with the kind of quiet pride I now understood. We waved to each other. Nothing more needed. Inside the house, I lit the fire and poured myself a drink. I opened the notebook I had used since the beginning of all this. The pages were full now, of dates, decisions, numbers, names. I flipped to the back and wrote a single sentence. They never expected me to rise. Then I closed the book and left it on the mantel. That night, as snow drifted down in soft layers and the windows fogged with warmth from the fire, I lay in bed with the covers drawn to my chin, and I allowed myself, finally, to feel safe again. Not triumphant, not victorious, just whole. If this story touched something deep in you, maybe you've lived through a storm of your own, I want you to know you're not alone. Sometimes silence becomes power. Sometimes walking away is winning. And sometimes the best revenge is simply surviving with your dignity intact. If you've ever reclaimed something that was taken from you, peace, home, or even just your own voice, this space is yours too. Leave a comment, share your truth, or just sit here with me for a while. No one's rushing you out. You're welcome to stay.